All right, so we're going to go deeper into this conversation, but first, let me introduce you to my co-host, Miss Bindi Belanger. We'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to have this conversation with Natalie. I am a former executive. I was working in corporate America for over 18 years before I decided to take a different path. And I recently became a meditation teacher and a purpose coach. And what I do is work with people who are in the middle of their spiritual awakening, helping them navigate that and then discovering their higher purpose in life. And I think that these conversations that we're going to have on the podcast are going to be so wonderful because the old way of leading is no longer working these days, and it really is about becoming a modern mindful leader. So I love it.
All right. So, Bindi, you have an 18 plus year career in tech in LA. Do you have any examples from your career of what modern mindful leadership looks like for you from what you've seen?
I definitely do. And I think what's been really interesting for me is watching the evolution of that. So having worked in the tech industry, there's still a lot of old school leadership, but there's also a new breed of leader coming in, and you can see how one set of, let's say, younger leaders is starting to influence the older ones. You can see the ones who are resistant to change saying, that's not how we do it. You can see the introduction of mindfulness. I was really fortunate to have worked at Live Nation as you did. That's where we met. In the last couple years, the CEO, Michael Rapino, introduced Mindful Nation, which was amazing. He brought meditation and mindfulness into the workplace, which gave everyone a great opportunity to actually to walk the walk, right? Including leaders. And as far as examples, I would say we're still very much at the early stages of this transformation. And one of the things that you mentioned in your conversation about what it means to be a modern mindful leader is really looking to the data and not making assumptions about what's happening in your organization. And I think that is something I've seen leaders do really well, is looking and engaging their employees, getting feedback and saying, what is the data telling us versus this is my personal experience of maybe with a small team or in a small segment of a business. And I think relying on that data is super eye-opening for executives. And that's why I feel like it's so important to do. It's eye-opening because it gives you insight into areas that you may not engage with on a day-to-day basis, especially if you're a senior executive. And especially when people are very open and honest with their comments, gives you a window into where there may be opportunities for improvement in your organization.
Sorry about that. I couldn't agree more. Backing up to something that you said about Live Nation, it was really cool to see Mindful Nation. It was like seeing mindfulness at scale, which I think a lot of companies have been wondering, how do we actually scale a program like that? So that was really cool. And then I totally agree. And it's interesting, where do you think, what does a balance look like between using data to make those data-driven decisions so that you can truly understand what people are thinking and feeling who are at, different levels, different parts of the org, having different experiences, and then intuition, where would you, is there a perfect balance between data and intuition as a modern mindful leader?
Yeah, and I think that balance, like any balance, is challenging to achieve. I think that what I've noticed is when the results of a survey, for example, come back, leaders have they intuitively know where the I don't want to say problems because that's not what we say, right? Modern mindful leaders say opportunities.
Opportunities.
Right. I think intuitive leaders already have a sense for where these problems or the challenges, opportunities lie. And the data confirms that in a lot of ways, but also gives them insight into what may be causing it, or it gives another layer of insight. So I think it's the data is really validation of that intuition. I don't think if you had someone who is not intuitive at all, just say, give me the data and let me go figure out how to solve this problem, they're going to miss the nuances. They're going to miss the, the trying to understand like what's really at the root of this, right? So the data will only tell us so much. It will say, this is a pocket where a problem exists, or this is an area where our company culture hasn't fully extended itself. We need to pay attention. But the intuition is really like, where is this rooted? Is this a leadership challenge? Is this a culture problem? Is this a regional issue? Is there something going on in that particular office in the US versus why is it not happening here? Mm-hmm. So I think you can't have one without the other. Data without the intuition, you're going to start making changes based on just numbers. Intuition without the data, like you don't really have validation that what your gut is telling you is actually what's happening. So I think it's really important to combine the two.
Totally. And isn't it, I feel like it's obvious to me, but doesn't it feel so obvious, the leaders who are like actively doing the work, like working on themselves, trying to grow as a human, trying to become a better person, meditating, engaged in some sort of mindfulness practice. Like, isn't it interesting when they get that data back? I feel like you can kind of tell the ones who are more likely to want to then do the work inside of the business, because they're not necessarily afraid of like peeling back layers or change or unpacking things, because they're used to bettering themselves. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. I think that what becomes really clear when the data is made available is who's self-aware and who's not. And there are people, I think a lot of leaders like to think that they're self-aware, but the ones who are surprised by the data, that's kind of a clue that maybe your awareness level is not where you thought it would be. And it's really interesting to see how people respond, right? There's the self-awareness where maybe the data is not wonderful and you see it and you're like, I didn't want to see this, but I understand where this is coming from, and I recognize we have a lot of work to do. And I think that speaks volumes to the level of leadership that person has, that they acknowledge that this isn't a personal dig necessarily. This is what's going on, and there's work to be done, versus someone who might look at that data and say, where is this coming from? Why would they say that? What's happening here? And like,
or I know who said this.
Yeah,
I know who said
almost
this.
Get defensive or in disbelief, like, oh, that's just such a small part of the business, or, they always rate low, and just kind of dismissive in a way. And I've noticed that especially women in leadership positions that will find this data, they tend to either they take it harder if it is negative, or they tend to express that they're taking it harder, because I know that this affects men as well, but women may be more expressive. They feel it very personally, and they feel this personal need or responsibility to go in and do the work to fix it. And that's good and bad, right? Because I think as women, there may be this tendency to, okay, I'm going to roll up my sleeves, I'm going to get in here, I'm going to fix it, versus acknowledging that this is an organizational problem that the organization needs to contribute to fixing. And that awareness is also really important. So not to make it all about what did I do wrong, but where did we as an organization maybe fall a little bit short, and how can I contribute to solving the problem? And I also think
unless it's like a 360 assessment that's directly about them as a leader, which I've done inside of multiple companies. And I will say, almost every 360 I've ever run and given coaching on afterward, women in general, I'm generalizing, but they tend to rate themselves lower than the other people rate them, unless it's a toxic leader. They rate themselves, whether it's male or female, they rate themselves way higher, and then the gap is is like, no, we need to address these gaps. Isn't that interesting?
It is. I always wish that I could be a fly on the wall in those 360 feedback sessions. I've had mine, and I totally agree. I rated myself much lower than other people rated me, and I don't know if that's because we as women we're trained to be more humble, or if it's like a personal thing that, there's this self-doubt or, whatever that exists. But I definitely saw a lot of women do that. What other experiences as an executive coach have you seen when people get into the data and the feedback on their organization, and how self-awareness kind of plays into that?
Oh my goodness. I think you said it beautifully. Like, the more self-aware they are, the more willing they are to look at the opportunities as just that. The less self-aware they are, the more likely they are to want to know who said what, to kind of dismiss it as, any excuse that they can come up with, or, oh, we're going to deal with that. We're already dealing with that. And the level of defensiveness is always really interesting.
How do you coach someone who's not a modern mindful leader yet? Maybe they're in that space of, they've got that self-awareness. They're not necessarily super defensive, but they're not taking the feedback very positively, I guess you would say.
Well, it depends. Like I work as a consultant too. So like if a company brings me in as a consultant and I'm doing like an employee engagement survey, and I'm not working as an executive coach, like with the founder or with the person responsible for this data, then it's going to be a different relationship than if I'm their coach and we're working on things and we are, really unpacking things, right? So like, let's say I've been brought in to do an employee engagement survey, and it turns out that there is some really difficult feedback that I'm feeding back to the founder. I would absolutely start with a one-on-one conversation, present the data, see what they have to say. I would ask them questions around, like, have they seen this before? Were there any inclinations, about this behavior, about these feelings, about these thoughts beforehand? If there is no awareness there, then you start really small, right? If there's no awareness there, then you have to meet people where they are, right? And your goal then is to create some awareness and to help buffer the emotional fallout that's going to happen from this little bit of awareness happening. And then you work to chip away at that. Oftentimes, it's why how you set up the survey is so important too, because if there aren't opportunities for employees to share more, like via qualitative analysis, like if it's just data, if it's just numbers, they may not believe it, but oftentimes it's the words that are really powerful in getting attention. I will say, though, it's oftentimes those leaders who will then latch on to words and say, I know who that is. I know who said that. And then if that's the case, like, if someone doesn't want to change, that's not my job to change that person, right? If they hired me to do an employee engagement survey and they don't want to listen to the results of the survey, then I know what I'm working with, right? So like, I'm not going to work with someone who has zero willingness to change. That just seems like a big waste of time, right? But if someone wants to change, they're open to it, but there's a little bit of defensiveness there, or there's concern, or there's some really tricky relationships inside of the organization, then I'll unpack that. Let's listen to that. Let's dive into that. And then I'll start to understand, like, if it's a relationship-based thing and they're like, I know who said that, it's because of this, then I really start to try to understand, like, okay, have have you dealt with relationships like that before? How long has this been going on? I start to unpack that relationship, and then I start to understand if that's a trend for this person as a leader in their work life.
When you take on executive coaching clients, is there a level of mindfulness or self-awareness that you kind of set as a minimum bar and say, I'm not going to work with you unless there's this level of self-awareness? And if so, how do you gauge that?
That's a great question. I think it's pretty intuitive for me. I don't have a rubric necessarily. It's not a score or anything like that. But I think that like I coach a lot of different people, and so the main thing is like displaying a real desire and a real willingness to be coached. I practice mindfulness-based meditation. I consider myself mindful. I consider myself a student of mindfulness. Like, I'm always learning and growing with it. But I have clients on the spectrum where I'm always, and I tell people this from the get-go before they hire me. I'm like, I'm always going to try to get you to meditate. I ask if they currently meditate, and if not, I ask if they're open to it. I have clients who are daily meditators, and I have clients who are like, oh my God, I hate it. I can't sit still. I fidget. I this, I that. I'm horrible at meditation, all the excuses, right? And so there's the whole spectrum, and they don't have to describe themselves as mindful. They don't have to be doing mindfulness-based meditation, but they have to have a willingness to do the work and to look at themselves and be open. And then from there, their openness and willingness gives me an idea of where to start with them. Because it's not always meditation, right?
Absolutely. I was going to say that there's other ways of practicing mindfulness, as you know, and you kind of have to try a few different practices with some people just to see what lands. And then, if mindful walking is something that works really well for them, then you introduce that, or 5 minutes of mindful breathing every day. One of the things that I love seeing over the last, 10 years, let's say, is the introduction of mindfulness at work, and more executives really understanding the benefits of mindfulness, not just for themselves personally, but for work. And I think that one of the most significant ways that mindfulness benefits leaders is that we have to recognize our own reactions, our own projections, our own ego, and how that's playing into our decision making, how that affects our strategic choices, how that affects our hiring. And without having that mindfulness and self-awareness of what is driving us, we often react in a very illogical. You say psychotic, I say illogical. That's a spectrum as well, right? And I think that it's so important for leaders to practice mindfulness, if for no other reason than that, to recognize when our own patterns, let's use that, right? Like, our own patterns are affecting our business in a way that is negative. And if we can't recognize those patterns, and we can't stop them, we can't heal them, we can't evolve them, which then will lead us to continue driving our business down a path that maybe it's not the best path. A lack of mindfulness will allow us to hire people that aren't the right, fit for an organization, or
are exactly like you, just because, they're like me, I should hire them.
Right. And a lack of mindfulness can lead to making decisions that in hindsight are very ego-based, right? Oh, I need to do this for my business because this is something that I've said I wanted to do for a really long time. And so I'm going to stick with that plan, even though the market is telling me that's not what the market wants. I'm going to go with that, and not having the awareness to say, wait a minute, my ego is driving this decision, versus whereas what do I really need to do? Why is my ego trying to drive this decision? What does the business actually need? That lack of awareness and that's something that I think is largely built and developed through a practice of mindfulness, like can be detrimental to your business. And I've seen it happen, right?
Totally.
In small businesses and large. And I think that what you'll notice is the people that have are let go with, not in a case of layoffs, but are fired, I guess, have a lot of mindfulness work to do, because what always surprises me is the shock that comes with the firing for many people. There are some people that are like, all right, yeah, I kind of knew this was coming. Other people are like, what? How could what? You're firing me? Like, where is this coming from? No awareness, which shocks me. And
Right.
I feel like those people are the ones who need mindfulness the most, but are probably the least likely to recognize that.
100%. It's like mindfulness gives you that beat, that mindful moment to just like pause, where then all of a sudden you're able to respond instead of react, and your decision making gets so much better because you're not simply, like you said, like going based off of your patterns and based off of that ego-based response, but instead you're able to read the room, to ask a question, to think about it a little bit longer, to let the information travel from the emotional center of your brain to the logic center of your brain, right? Like and I think that's one of the reasons why it's so revolutionary, right? Like it will change almost every area of your life, from your like road rage problem to your communication with your significant other, to how you deal with your kids and your employee. I mean, it's amazing. And it's always the place I try to start with people when I'm coaching them, because it'll change your life. I feel like we're not promoting anything. Like we're not even selling mindfulness based.
No,
whatever.
but I actually, like, if I could sell mindfulness, that's what I would want people to understand, that it's not like, especially mindfulness meditation is not necessarily about anything spiritual. It is, it is largely secular. About this. Yeah. And secular mindfulness is largely about becoming aware so that you stop reacting and start responding. And I love how you put that, because I don't think people realize like how much of our lives we spend just reacting. We don't think before we respond. It's this automatic, largely ego-driven, when I say ego, I don't mean like, oh, someone's got a big head. I mean like when we talk about the ego in psychology versus like, let's say your soul or spirit, right? That this pattern that's been established in us is the one that's reacting without our consciousness stepping in and saying, wait a minute, how do I want to respond to this? And having, going from autopilot to conscious choice, that's what mindfulness is about. And I think that as a leader, if you are not doing that, you are way behind the game, right? Mm-hmm. That you're letting this patterned ego run the show instead of your conscious choices. And I think for no other reason, that's why leaders need to be practicing mindfulness. So if we were selling it, that's what I would say.
Amen. Hallelujah. Sold. Sign me up.
And I'm sure we could talk about mindfulness for another several hours, but we're gonna continue this conversation, I'm sure, in a future podcast. So thank you, Natalie, for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you. I loved learning from you.
And I hope you'll join us for our next episode, which is going to be on how empathic leaders can deal with some of the challenges that the workplace introduces.
Thanks.
See you then.
Cheers.
Bye.